Sophia, you opened your chapter with a really brilliant quote by Dr. Akomolafe, and I was wondering if you could walk us through that, especially given scenario planning's historical precedence with the military.
Sure. This quote by Dr. Bayo Komolafe is from a talk that he gave at the Future School, which is now known as TSFX. The future is a very militaristic concept that emerged from a commitment. It's an invitation for us to notice how the future cannot be really embraced until we really look into how a militaristic era created and still creates and produces our infatuation and obsession with the future, right? The future, again, is not natural. The future is a political commitment to mastery, right? To control, to controlling the variables so that we can predict the next, because our bodies are still ringing with the explosions of Hiroshima and the trauma of that moment. What next to do, except to know what next, or how to navigate the complexities of what next.
Welcome to Scenarios for Tomorrow, a podcast where we turn tomorrow's headlines into today's thought experiments. This first series includes conversations with the authors of our latest book, Improving and Enhancing Scenario Planning, Futures Thinking Volume, from Edward Elgar Publishing. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Crawford, and throughout this first series, you'll hear from my guests the numerous global techniques for practicing and advancing scenario planning. Enjoy! Today, we are lucky to have two guest authors with us here to discuss their work in our joint book together. Sophia Bazil is a futures literacy and foresight researcher and practitioner with a background in business management and foresight. Her approaches draw upon conventional frameworks and are grounded in decolonial and Black feminist theory and praxis. Perhaps most importantly is her commitment to lifelong and life-wide unlearning. Her emergent futuring is inspired and informed by her situatedness and lived experiences as a first-generation daughter of the Haitian diaspora, born and raised in New York, and as a long-term guest inhabitant of Latin America, the UAE, East and Southeast Asia, and as of 2025, Africa. Sophia is currently affiliated with the African Innovation Summit Foundation and One Resilient Earth nonprofit. Professor Geci Karuri-Sebina is an African scholar practitioner based in Johannesburg, working in the intersection between people, place, time, and technological change with a focus on the global South. She is currently an associate professor at the Wits School of Governance, where she is hosting the African Civic Tech Innovation Network and establishing a center of excellence in digital governance. Geci is currently the Islamic World Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization Chair on Innovation and Futures in Africa, and a founding director of the Southern Africa Node of the Millennium Project. Geshi's background is in computer science, architecture, urban design, and innovation systems. Welcome both. It is great to have you here today. Though we worked on this book together for well over a year, we've never actually had the opportunity to be in the same room and just chat about things and our work and what we're doing, which makes today additionally special. I've been looking forward to our episode in particular because your expertise, built from your backgrounds and your experiences, brings perspectives to this book and to the conversation in general from our everyday realities that just simply aren't integrated well enough into the futures and foresight practice yet. We understand that not all of our listeners are familiar with scenario planning, though they may have heard more about it since the pandemic. And one of the motivations to this podcast is to bring our world of futures and foresight science outside the walls of academia, where within, language is understandably closely controlled, but knowledge is not as easy to access as we generally wish it to be, which just means we're here to have a chat with the public. Your chapter in the book is titled The Wilds Beyond 2x2 Futures, an Enquiry into Decolonizing Foresight. And your chapter has an absolutely excellent opening quote.
That quote does an incredible job of just Well, first of all, Bayo Komolafe, I don't think he's ever called himself a futurist. And I think if you ever asked him what a Delphi scenario is, or any of these methodologies that we have been talking about throughout this book and what this critique is about, these very technical things would be very beyond him. So, what really captured me about this quote and why I thought it was so vital to include in this paper and even worthy of opening this paper with is because it traces the genealogy of scenario planning and its inextricable link to the evolution of modern future studies, but it does so in such an evocative way. It tells the same story about how the very concept of future and these methodologies, particularly scenario planning, which we're focusing on in this book, are very, very militaristic concepts that are based on prediction, mastery, control, rooted in fear, rooted in ideas of scarcity. And I think, well, in our paper, we definitely trace the origin, citing authors such as Curry, who have written extensively about this, about how the field of modern future studies has started, a post World War II era, and there are two distinct strands of future studies, but scenario planning was very much rooted in the US military context. And so much research money was poured into that to maintain this newly established positioning as a world superpower. And that evolved into the 50s and 60s, totally eclipsing the more European strand of future studies, which was more critical and more focused on social reconstruction of societies after World War II. So these distinct strands emerged. And then the 70s came about. So the military industrial complex are things that are really, really well traced. But I loved Amokomalafe's quote because it really captured the emotional and affective states of futuring, which are often neglected in our practices of future studies that are very much focused on methodologies. And I think that's something that we're here to explore as decolonial practitioners. I just want to close with a piece that didn't make the cut of the final paper because as as we were writing this chapter, in December 2023, I found myself sitting there working with this background of what future studies was. And naturally, that leads you to think about the moment we're sitting in today and what might lie ahead. We cited Sardar in talking about foresight work's overemphasis on scenarios, which is really devouring future studies. And I think the same does hold true today. It's almost like the myth of the Ouroboros, a serpent eating its own tail, or Sisyphus doomed to rolling the same boulder up the same hill for eternity to come. It's a commitment to further entrenching conventional scenarios practice as foundational to effective futures thinking. And this signifies a commitment to reproducing the world we created in 1945. And very interestingly, I was just scrolling Instagram and there was a post that talked about how in Balinese, a Hindu culture, December 2023 transitioning in the Gregorian calendar was actually the year 1945 in Balinese culture. And in Haitian culture, it was the exact 200-year anniversary of Haiti's revolution, which is one of the most significant revolutions in our collective history that is purposely excluded because it was so consequential to the denial of our possibilities for a society of equals and all that's emerged economically and socially and politically since then. So that was just a gesture towards that we're not even living on the same particular timelines. There's a quote from the Entangled Time Tree that was that might have made it into another part of the paper. In order for us to have such transformative thinking, instead we need to employ methods that can disarm deeply held but often harmful beliefs around natural resource extractivism and the exploitation of labor, individualism, and the ceaseless capitalist quest for economic growth. Because these beliefs and the values that underpin them prime the imagination towards scenarios of inevitable dystopia and collapse, and if they continue to dominate our worldviews. So Herman Kahn, the father of scenario planning, who encouraged us to think the unthinkable. And that entire evolution of scenario planning, Shell using scenario planning to predict climate change, but in a quest for profit and continued domination of the markets, hiding climate change from us, speaks to the fact that it's not just about the tools itself, it's the way these masters use these tools to create the world and make certain worlds possible or impossible.
That is a perspective that you absolutely shine through in the book. And unsurprisingly, nobody else is talking about this, but you really bring to light this idea of colonizing the future. You know, having that the practice of scenario planning and maybe the broader practice of futures and foresight has a very homogenous view because it comes from very homogenous roots. And I think that you highlight that really well with the calendar system, just the perception of time itself, because that's what scenario planning is, right? It's us using our ingrained perception of time to, you know, try and anticipate the future time. What is the future? And your chapter really brings in not only what are perceptions, but what is even the future and what can it be? So I'd like to take that what you've said. You use this term colonize the future. I was wondering, building on what you said, could you help us understand a bit more of what you mean by that, especially around this inbuilt sort of like what do you call it, friction within scenario planning, and specifically where they ask, we are taught to, and we teach our clients and we work with our clients to come up with plausible futures, right? But as you quote Herman Kahn as saying, think of the unthinkable, and plausible and unthinkable aren't really the same thing, and would almost be considered dichotomous opposites. So I'll stop there. I would like to, yeah. What's your work around this concept of colonizing the future?
I'm happy to comment on this one. So it's interesting because the kind of decolonial turn, which I think has been there across a number of fields, I think is often reduced to just being about the historical actions of European states, really focused on territorial, political, and economic imposition, exploitation in Africa, in the Americas, and other such. And it's easy, and I think that is part of it, but I think it's really easy to think it's only about that, and therefore it becomes about giving voice to the global South, as though that's the only issue. And I think for us, starting there, like what's the colonial question in the first place? I think for us it's about the much more insidious and ongoing systems of power that really perpetuate inequality and dominance, really at an ideological level and at a much more ontological level as well. That there is this sort of hegemonic control on future narratives that have historically been controlled by very singular views, and normally Western, but not only that. And I think for us, when we talk about decolonial, then we're really referring to the move away from that worldview, that the Eurocentric or any centric worldview is what's important and is what's common and is what's within that plausible cone, and that anything else is inferior or marginal or irrelevant or even dangerous. And that's what we actually say. That's actually a direct quote from the paper. When one of the papers we cite is one I worked on with Bourgeois and Iba Foucault, where we talk about the future as a public good. And there we're really trying to highlight very specifically that the future, like any other resource, can actually be colonized. It can be made a private or a club good if there are dominant powers that act to exclude any alternative view of what's possible in that future. And often those are views from the global South. And the global South, not as a geography, but as indigenous voice, as places that could be located geographically in the global North. Patriarchy is part of that as well, and that's obviously located everywhere. So what we try to do is to argue that colonizing the future is something that dominates what the narrative is, and that the power to do that isn't equally distributed. And so historical colonial structures can continue to play into that, but that's not the only perspective, that's not the only concern we have. So we want to try to decolonize futures by opening up the space for imagination, for what the assumptions are about plausibility, not being defined by whiteness. And when I say whiteness, I don't mean sort of the color white, but more the Akomolafe white, this idea of modernity and northern hegemony.
This is probably one of the featured pieces of work, and the two of you as practitioners in the field that are really reflecting where scenario planning and futures and foresight obviously not only need to go, but where we're really trying to push it to go, getting out of those 20th century roots. And that's, I don't want to knock, too much the foundations of any scientific field, but that is the progress of science, right? It starts in a small space, and then as more people become learned professionals in it, we really push it, right? We really try to push it into ever more broader boundaries. And what you're talking about really puts me in mind of the way I describe science to students and at on panels and stuff, on public talks, which is science is not about being truthful as much as about being accurate. Let's accurately reflect reality. A truth, comes within that. And that's what I hear when you talk, when y'all are talking about a colonized future and decolonizing that future, and really thinking the unthinkable, which, is, we don't mean this in an oxymoronic kind of way, but it's thinking of things you haven't thought of before, right? And with scenario planning, it's the effort of trying to get people into a space to facilitate thinking we can't think of on our own. So, right. Okay. I'm trying to back off a little bit. There's so much we could talk about, or y'all could talk about it. There was a point made earlier about this Western-centric assumption about quote unquote progress, which goes into that experience of time, which goes into the experience of your place within your culture and your meaning, the meaning of our own selves as actors in our culture. And in the West, when I was thinking about that, at least in the Western American European kind of perspective, it's very, if not exclusively, economically based. Progress is an economic measure, and that still to this day is either Keynesian or Friedman. I mean, it's there really is outside of within the West, those are the two major camps, and that's where we value progress. And I recently heard an advisor, I can't remember, it was the last presidency, so I do apologize for not remembering the name, but he was saying that we're in this state now in the US where economics is our new religion. It is the language of our gods. And if you speak economics, you speak power, as far as the US system is concerned. And so I wanted to bring this back to your work, to what you're talking about with this, breaking away from these unspoken, assumed, intuitive roots of scenario planning, what has been building the futures field. So I'll just throw it out there. How do you think these dominant practices actively or passively exclude marginalized perspectives?
Yeah. I like the example you just gave about the economic dominance, and it calls to mind a recent exercise I was part of, where right at the offset, just off the blocks, somebody raises their hand and says, it's fine for us to talk about all of these other issues about the future, but I think we should agree on one foundational point, which is the economics have to make sense, because if nobody's going to pay for it, then none of this matters. Mm-hmm. So of course, like maybe a couple of us in the room are like, what? But in a way that's very typical of how you lead into scenario planning, or you get led into a scenario planning, and in a way, I think it's not a mistake. This play we had on the 2x2 is obviously partly about the 2x2 matrix, but it's also talking in a way about matrix thinking, right? That in the matrix, the boundaries are clear, the plausibility is clear, what's reasonable and agreed can be agreed at the beginning of the meeting to only be economic. And there's work I've been part of where we've commented with authors like Aliun Sal about the idea of orphan variables, that we'll go into a whole process of foresight and certain things are just never talked about. They just don't come up. And now to some people, it's strange that they don't come up, but in the dominant frame, it's obvious that they don't come up. And those orphan variables often are some of the softer issues we raise in the paper. It's the relationality, it's the different ways of being. It's even in dominant terms, the cultural variables will be softer or lighter. And the word soft is often used, like soft issues. So I think the idea that progress is Rostovian, it's linear, it's Cartesian, it's science, and all of these defined in a particular way, is, I think, a very inbuilt aspect of how we have tended to learn. It's how I learned scenario planning, and I think it's how many of us do. And then the methods frame that. And then I think, as Sophia has commented, then the dominance of the method means that it almost becomes what defines the practice of foresight. And I think those Western-centric assumptions, those knowledges, those ontological and those epistemological unspoken ideas about what it means to make progress, what time means and how time works, really exclude the possibility of anything else. And whether it's excluding actual voices in the room, or whether it's excluding actual perspectives in the world, and then, of course, excluding any other possibility, and by calling it implausible. I used to use that term all the time, and we'd very actively say to people, oh, we're not here to sort of talk crazy, right? We are here to talk about things that are within the realm of the plausible. That's a really colonial thing to be made to think, and it's a really colonial thing to say.
Right. I think maybe because of who we are in the field we're in, we get the privilege of having learned to be a little more aware of when we start using that language, or when someone around us starts using that language. Because yes, it is very, very, I mean, that's just a cultural norm, pretty much, at least where I grew up, is, you think implausibilities and you ignore the implausibilities, and lo and behold, implausibilities happen all the time. All the time. It doesn't mean impossibility. And that's what we have new words for that, right? Well, we don't have new words. We have popularized words for it, like technological disruptions and what's the other one? Wicked problems, right? And so we start building this language around what we're also actively denying, which is implausibility. And I think one of the greatest things happening to the sustainability of all of us is that we're becoming more global. But by becoming more global, we really need to shift our assumptions about the plausible, about the implausible. And I'm going to put this in the show notes. I like your term orphan variables. It's very evocative, and it clearly speaks to what you're talking about, to what we're talking about here. Geci, I'd like to bring us back to one thing that you said earlier. You talk about the 2x2 matrix, which is in your title. In the field of scenario planning, it is one of the opening methods or techniques, if you will, that we learn in the overall methodology of scenario planning. I was wondering if you could walk us through what a 2x2 matrix is that you were, particularly in your context.
Actually, I'd love if Sophia could come in to talk about this one. But just to remind us about the point she made earlier, that we're quite aware that it's maybe unfair to characterize all of scenario planning as 2x2, because it's obviously not the only technique. But I think there was I don't know if it was a double meaning to it that we sort of appealed to us. But Sophia, would you mind maybe?
Sure. Thank you. We certainly wouldn't be the first to critique the 2x2 scenario framework. It's been critiqued by Slaughter and called the flatland of scenario planning. It's been deconstructed, and we are not calling all scenario planning 2x2s. We're well aware that, for example, the shell method, which is oft conflated with the 2x2 method, was actually the inspiration for the 2x2 method. what we wanted to highlight in this paper is that it doesn't take a futurist or foresight practitioner expert to realize what is problematic about the 2x2 scenario framework. The fact that its very axes seek to just reduce to these four possibilities of very linear directions, a Cartesian framework, if you will, um, for how these possibilities can emerge. And it really simplifies to just these two determinants on the X and Y axis, and there's any range. So it produces these false dichotomies, essentially, where it relies on selecting these two key uncertainties, and they create these artificial oppositions or tensions, and they may ignore a lot of the interdependencies between these other factors that we're completely ignoring. So it's this flat land, and it just ignores a lot of other things. So thus there's this limited exploration of alternative futures. People can get this, what was the analogy? It's a McDonald's type of thing, right? It's quick, it's easy, it's filling, but is it nutritious? And is it actually providing you nourishment? And that's what we wanted to just really emphasize, that the 2x2 scenarios aren't easy when they're an entryway into future studies, which is great. But the fact that they persist in practice and people use these, even really experienced and expert practitioners continue to use these as a quick and easy win with clients, and more broadly scenarios. Also, we kind of explored that as a path to winning strategy rather than to doing rigorous futures exploration, as some of the critiques that we have for the 2x2 matrix and that kind of extend. So these binaries that they create, it misses a lot of nuance. We also talk about there's this overemphasis on plausibility, which Geci mentioned. So these axes that are going to be privileged, if you're going to do this once, you're going to choose what's most plausible, and then you're reducing the uncertainties to an even greater extent. So these prioritizations of what a small group of people deem what is logical or coherent or plausible really doesn't allow for an expansive, or it occludes transformative futures that might be more disruptive or insightful. There's also very limited capacity for very intersectional or decolonial perspectives in those particular frames. Even with so there's the 2x2, but then there's also, we looked at, excuse me, oh my gosh, I shouldn't forget one of the father of futures, University of Jim Dater, sorry. Dater's four generic futures also use these quadrants, and there's been responses to this critique of the 2x2 scenario. But what we're seeing is just that people are still creating these matrices, and their different quadrants still fall into the growth, decline, collapse, transform frame. And you can see that again and again. So these false innovations that are not really addressing the underlying issues of what the real critiques of scenario planning are a diversion and a waste of time and a waste of a lot of resources. Our critique is that also not just the 2x2, which we apply to more broadly scenarios planning, it just consumes a lot of the literature, which means it consumes a lot of the possible intellectual and other praxis-related inquiries that we could be, that might better serve us at this point, at this point in time. So there's many other critiques that we could offer. It's in terms of complexity, it just really does not allow for us to delve really deep into the complex and often interdependent nature of many of the wicked problems we are facing nowadays. And there's also quite a bit of difficulty in actionability with the 2x2 scenarios, but also we find with scenarios in general, people create these scenarios, whether it be an external team of consultants that comes in to create these scenarios and writes them, or whether it's a more participatory process where they are involving different people from the organization or the community. But what happens to that matrix after? Sure, it may get translated into a narrative of some sort, but then, okay, these scenarios were created, great. They then go sit somewhere and we did them. How are they informing the strategy, and how are they, how are they actually being used? There's very little research that actually proves the effectiveness and the usefulness of scenarios. There's very little evidence to show that they are worth the amount of time and energy that we spend consumed with them in this in the futures field.
Yes, that is a major point of contention overall in the field. Again, something, a standard feature that plagues, if you will, futures or not early scientific fields, the budding, stage of them, is that we need to figure out how to measure impact. And when we think about scenario planning, and a lot of futures work, a lot of foresight work. These are science by practice, right? Praxis. It's we're working with organizations, we're working in the field, which means less control over variables, co-occurring variables, less clarity in what we can measure. And then you've got the entire intellectual property rights factor in there, where organizations shut themselves off once these strategy workshops happen. And so we can't go back and see, well, what did you do? How did you do it? Did it work out? Particularly if it didn't work out, right? As a general rule, I think organizations don't like to share that they failed at something. Okay, so let's bring it back to your work. We had a lot of topics we were interested in discussing. I mean, your chapter is for anybody who gets the book, which everybody should get the book, and there's ebook and hardback copies, and your library has copies, and you can just reach out to us. We'll see what we can do. The thing is, your chapter is so completely different from everybody else's, and your chapter actually argues against a few of the other chapters, saying, no, this is actually not the case, or actually this other thing is the case. And your chapter doesn't do a lot of shoulding. It's not very normative. It's very, or proscriptive or prescriptive, if you will. It's very informative and I don't want to sound terrible and say thought-provoking, but it's thought-provoking. And in the best way, which means we have a lot of things we could cover. So I'm going to pass the mic to you, Sophia or Geci. What is something else in this chapter that you really wanted to get out to the larger audience?
Ooh, should we play rock, paper, scissors, Sophia? I think there's a lot. We had such great conversations in the process of pulling a paper together like this. And so maybe I'll just lead with that, Sophia, and then maybe you can jump on in. But just this idea that we wanted to talk about, just yes, framing what the 2x2 was about. And as Sophia has said, the critique is there. So that wasn't what was novel in what we were doing. I think how we were doing it and why we were doing it is what we thought we were bringing to the fore. So this point about, and it's not something we do a lot in the future space because we're not philosophers, most of us, a few of us like Dr. J are. But really talking about things like ontology and who are we, and what are we trying to do, and how do we know things when we bring people into a room and begin talking about the future. How we do that matters, and so what doesn't make it into the space matters. And we think that there's something significant about that. We think it's ethically significant. We think it's relationally significant. We think it's politically significant. To have done that. So I think there's a lot that's important to us in how we tried to sort of step out those arguments. And we had a lot of feedback in review, because when you do that, when you're sort of questioning things, then obviously there's a lot of having to back yourself up in terms of, well, what do you mean by that? And, so there was a lot of that. And even that engagement, I think, was good. But yeah, I mean, I guess maybe one of the perspectives we could easily speak about are some of the more non-Western and non-hegemonic views we thought that we were beginning to call to question here. Maybe I'll hand over to Sophia to see what she wants to bring up, and I can probably talk about one or two as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so our paper was a philosophical deconstruction of scenario planning and by relation future studies. And I'm not sure how I wound up there. I've only been in futures for 5 years, but I'm very drawn to the philosophical stuff. I think my name is Sophia, which I didn't love when I was young. I only knew Sophia from the Golden Girls, and I thought it was such an uncool name. But in midlife now, I think it's come full circle, and I'm very much drawn to these deeper questions. And I took a very roundabout way into future studies, much of what Geci's described, the typical path of being introduced to scenario planning, and going through the European and US consultancy context, where all of this is just very implicit and never questioning. And then suddenly it dawning on me like, oh my gosh, like, wow, this is this is not at all the only possibility, and having to unlearn so much, but also if having a feeling like coming home to myself, because I have this theory, it's not a formal one that's been tested, but I think particular people on this planet, Black people, indigenous communities, we are natural futurists. Like, we are adept at understanding complexity and systems and navigating and adapting and responding to emergence. Because otherwise, how would we have endured all of these years and all of these challenges and constantly innovated in ways that might not fit the Western paradigm of innovation all the time, but are very much innovative in ways of being. So that's what we came down to. And we broke it down into the ontological and epistemological, which is often hybridized into onto-epistemological. Ontologies are what are ways of being, our understanding of what it means to be. The epistemological study is around how do we know, what is knowledge. And we also talked about the role of language, and that is logocentricity. And we explored notions of time. And I think what we wanted to highlight is that we're seeing improvements in terms of what is included in participatory scenario planning. First of all, is that it can be done in a more communal and relational way. It can be more participatory and include, but there are also dangers with that. And Cash Kanu from the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective is also at UBC, and many others, Sarah Ahmed, write about on the dangers of inclusion. Inclusion is the bare minimum. What is happening beyond that inclusion that is making it beyond tokenism, or that is actually not perpetuating harm in the inclusion of marginalized people and perspectives, is something that we can, as we mentioned before, learn to measure for or learn to put some guardrails in for. In our paper, we also talk about the use of storytelling and the use of arts and creativity, other ways of expressing. And there's been some successful endeavors with this. I think we can cite an example of we worked together on this Youth Futures project in the East and Southern African region. And when I tell you, just the feel of the room is completely different than futuring in a Western context or in Europe. There's a different levity, there's a joy, there is song, there is poetry. This is not even something you have to make explicit, that these forms of expression are welcome. This is what just emerged from putting these people in a room together who may not be legible in certain contexts, but really have such a beautiful and evocative way of communicating ideas that is really perhaps more, what's the word I'm looking for? Illustrative than the flattening and caging of the English language that we try to package futures in and tell everybody that this is how you need to speak about the future using this language with it and these terms. And if you can't, you're not qualified to talk about your imagination or to express your imagination unless it comes in this package. So I think Geci, yeah.
I love that you talked about packaging futures. I think it's such beautiful language because there's a part where we talk about and why we call the paper "The Wilds Beyond the Two by Two" was again playing. I mean, maybe we're overusing Bayo. We might have to give him some credit for the chapter, but Bayo Komalafe's book was "The Wilds Beyond These Fences," and so we talk about the wilds beyond the two by two. And so one of the phrases I picked out here is that this is the wilds beyond what we know and control. It's the space of imagination that is genuinely open to unknowing and the unknown. And so when you talk, Sophia, about the packaging of futures so that they can be neat, so that they can be legible, so that it's easier to work with. And these are the arguments. I mean, it's why we use the 2x2. It makes it easier to deal with a lot of complexity. But in doing that, we are packaging the future. We are saying that this is the box and that's how everything fits. And what Bayo tries to evoke with his book is that there's so much more beyond the fences. You just have to be brave enough to go beyond those fences. And if that means bringing in the body and we don't quite know what's going to happen, but we're open to it. We don't quite know what's going to happen when we don't insist that the pestle are the only headlines, or the steeple that, what can be brought into this, because that's all we can manage. And if somebody brings in something crazy, we don't know what to do with it.
Right, we call it potpourri or other.
Exactly. So that transform, Megan, that you're saying is interesting. That is crazy space. You don't really know what to predict about what might come up, and it might be very difficult to deal with. It might not be easy to do our M&E after that, our monitoring and evaluation, once we have something that we couldn't quite have predetermined. But there's something about that willingness not to know and that openness to what the youth or the participants or whatever will bring into the space that I think does a few things. I think one, it invites our humility, which I think is really important, because us being humble as the scenario planning facilitator, but also as the participants in a foresight exercise, opens up space. It opens up space for us, and the burden isn't on us to come up with 4 very clever stories with very clever headlines that everybody thinks it's very clever. That's not on us because that's going to be emergent, right? So that's a lot of baggage off our backs, but it also opens up space for others. They don't have to fit into the package. They can bring what they have. And things, the idea of collective intelligence is things that can emerge out of that new shared narrative, I think, becomes truly open. I think it also allows us to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. So we keep coming up with some variation of the same scenarios, basically. So fairly predictable outcomes of most foresight exercises. And I think that openness beyond the package allows more than that to come up. But then I think very importantly for Sophia and I is this acknowledgement of the power dynamics that makes certain knowing more important than somebody's unknowing. So why is the fact that you're so certain about something more important than the fact that I'm questioning something? And that's what happens in a scenario exercise, because the thing that is clear can be documented because it's languaged, it's agreed upon by other people, it's packaged. So that makes it. But then the one that's a little messier, that we're not quite sure, if you're lucky, you're in the parking lot, most likely you're not even on the table. And so I think that power dynamic is something we really wanted to bring in, because I think that's what begins to speak to a future that really can be public, that really can be shaped by a collective understanding that's inclusive. And I think adaptability comes out of that. We keep talking about needing to be adaptable and agile and innovative and creative, but that doesn't come out of a package. That doesn't come out of everything we already know. So anyway, I think these ideas really excited us, and it was also fun, I think, to be welcomed by the wonderful editors. To do that, to have a chapter maybe that was different and didn't answer the question. I know a few of our reviewers felt that we should tell people what to do now. And we were like, well, it's the wilds,
No, it's an absolutely perfect response to that level of feedback. It's the plague of being in business research, right? It's in philosophy, psychology, even physics. You get to say, I just want to experiment on, so I just have a question. I just want to find the answer to the question, whatever it may be. But in business, it's like, okay, great. What does it mean for this industry, or what does it mean for this client? So absolutely. And I don't know who your reviewers are, but I know who the authors are on the book. And yeah, everybody's from a business background, everybody. So one way or another. I cannot emphasize and support your comments enough about following on from the actual physical exercise of going through scenario planning, what it's supposed to mean, right? What is the purpose of scenario planning? It's not to go through this empty exercise. It's to impact something, is to be a tool for positive impact on whatever the thing is that you're trying to scenario plan around. And the thing that's going to facilitate that more than anything else is exactly what you said, Geci, which was you got to be open. You have to be open. We can think of transformational, we can come up with all sorts of scenarios about this, and that, and the other. And like you said, you can have anybody and everybody at the table. You can have that participatory, you can have the looks of participatory scenario planning where you have a lot of representation at the table. But I wish I could remember who said this, because I think this is one of those moments they were talking about that I hadn't quite articulated in my own mind. But the line is, representation without investment is exploitation. So you're just, virtue signaling, or you're just ticking a box, as they say in the UK, just ticking a box. We got the stakeholders in there, right? And then with that comes the openness. How many times has somebody been in a room and trying to help strategize about an idea, and in the end they go with what they've always gone with before? We have cautionary tales, if you will, of past organizations that seemed too big to fail, that 100% failed because they just didn't have the openness that was that mitigating or moderating factor that is necessary in this space. And that feeds right into openness to who you're going to bring to the table. And that's going to leave you openness to what you're willing to think of for the future, and then the openness, all of it. Yes. Like I said, I cannot emphasize that enough. So I will stop there because I'll just keep going on and chattering. Yeah. So with that in mind, I've got my big question for y'all, and I ask everybody at the end. And it's because I am personally extremely fascinated in whatever the answer may be. And the question is, what trends are you seeing now in your area of work?
Well, this is such a funny question, and we chuckle because the trend scouting and the trend reports is where our mind first went. It was like, no, we are not going to do AI agentic and this rundown of top 10 things that are going to disrupt everyone's world in 2025. That's not the approach we decided to take. It was a challenge to kind of think of this question. I hope Geci will add on, but I'm going to go back to something that you mentioned, which is that you hope people will join us from the margins, or I was thinking in the cracks, right? Where we have been exploring futures, just a different orientation towards the very notion of future, and how divesting from that a bit and just being, allowing ourselves to embrace a very messiness, a squishiness, when it comes to things like time, or when it comes to things like should and ought to be. We're seeing more people wading into there, but I think they're compelled by different forces, right? I'm going to cite Geci here and talk about innovation prospecting. And this is not something that's new. It's not new that people from the dominant culture are going to indigenous or African cultures at innovation prospecting, right? Showing up, and suddenly you can hear and see people citing the language of liberation, and everybody is citing Audre Lorde, or everyone's inviting Bayo Kamolafe or Dr. Vanessa Andriotti or Dr. Geci Karuri-Sebina to come talk and to offer this disruptive experience that is going to thrust people into a decolonial futures trajectory. Yeah, but that's about where it stops, I see, right? I really appreciate that people who do not formally situate themselves in the futures and foresight community and practice, especially in academia, but are in the space, are taking the lead in these conversations around systems transformation and complexity. And they're offered this platform. But what happens after that, it's almost like they're being consumed, right? They're being consumed, they're being added to some futures practitioners' tool belt of how they can use this language or use these ideas for their new offerings, but it stops there. I've taken a lot of courses. Decoloniality is a process. Just like coloniality is an ongoing process, decolonizing oneself and one's practices is an ongoing, lifelong, life-wide process. And I've sat in courses and I've rarely seen academically qualified futures practitioners sitting and learning for any extended period of time from these scholars that they're willing and very quick to cherry pick what's useful for them from, to give the appearance of being, well, I was almost going to say woke, but of being, decolonial orientation, but the praxis is there, right? So it's still very much commodifying, taking something from somewhere and almost selling it back and commodifying it, legitimizing it, but going no further. And we would hope that when we talk about building these organizations of these future or these economic systems of the future, we have to practice our futures, right? How else are they going to come into being? We have to move beyond just writing about these things and speaking about these things. I'm going to age myself, but we say, don't speak about it, be about it, right? So we can talk, but when are we going to actually practice running our organizations like this, actually focus on our collaborations, the way that we talk about them, and embodying these very principles that we know are vital. There's a saying by Vanessa Andreotti that you only know if you can swim when the water's up to your waist. I didn't get it exactly correct, but these waters are rising. We are reaching times. Some of us, well, we're definitely not swimming in the same rivers and not equipped with the same tools and not navigating the same waters, but we all pretty in for a pretty, adventurous sail into the horizon right now. So how are we going to respond to that as practitioners? This is something that we all have to take responsibility and accountability for ourselves and individually, but how else can we be held accountable other than in community? So there's that balance of navigating your own path. It really is choose your own adventure. And I try not to really, really pass judgment on anything, but also when the people who have the most to lose and who have already given up the most to be in this space are the ones who are also charged with doing the really, really hard work of being epistemically humble, of doing this unlearning constantly. It's exhausting, right? So, and the invitation is open. The more, the merrier. We're happy to have you. Promise. We're still here somehow, so we don't bite. We're not that scary. We laugh a lot. We love humor and to have fun. So I just think there's just so much space for lots more humility, which is coming one way or another. I think it's inevitable that there's going to be some humbling moments for us as individual practitioners and for the field, and there are opportunities to reflect.
Well, beautifully said. Thanks. So I don't have anything to add. I completely agree. I was just laughing here. I was remembering, so John Sweeney, who's a futurist who I quite enjoy, also known as Sophia, he reminded me about a year or two ago about a thing I had discussed in an interview like 10 years ago, like a really long time ago, where I'd spoken about foresight being like hygiene, like, it's you're going to have to brush your teeth, and I think you're going to have to do some foresight in an organization. I think it's just good hygiene. And I was just thinking in terms of this kind of prospecting or appropriation of certain techniques, that it's probably more useful to think about foresight like that, as hygiene, as toothpaste, rather than as lipstick. Because you can appropriate lipstick. You can look, and there's a lot of lipstick that's been going around, I think. There's a lot of whether it's getting the language down or appearing to use the method, or, I mean, futures literacy is an interesting term because obviously that came out of very much the work of UNESCO and Riel Miller. And actually at its core, if you're really to look into it, it's very decolonial in terms of what it's trying to do. But then what began to happen is everybody began to say they were doing futures literacy. Futures literacy began to literally mean just appearing to be able to say that, you can say futures literacy. So it became quite a literal thing. So it became lipstick. And I think if we can really get into it, if we can really take the time, and I appreciate actually, Megan, your quote about representation without investment is exploitation. I think also appropriating language and ideas without really reflecting about what they mean. And what's beautiful to me is that these ideas are resonant in context, and everybody's in a context. And so in a way, to grab the lipstick from over there and slap it on is to ignore the fact that there's a hygiene issue in your own context that may not apply to, and you're probably better off investing yourself where you are and understanding that the work is about you. The work isn't about, borrowing it from somebody else. So there's something in there. And so, yeah, I would completely agree with Sophia that I think there is this tendency in the space. And I know people want to seem, whether it's woke or relevant or whatever in a moment, but there's a real deep opportunity here. And I think I've often made the point that the idea of decolonizing, again, like I said, I think Black people are colonized. I think white people are colonized. It's deeper, and it applies to all of us. And I hope it's a project that we can all see ourselves in.
Scenarios for Tomorrow is produced by me, Megan Crawford, with invaluable feedback from Dr. Isabella Riza, Jeremy Creep, Brian Ego, and as always, my kids. This is a production of the Futures and Analytics Research Hub and FAR Lab, affiliated with Edinburgh Napier Business School. You can find show notes, references, and transcripts at scenarios.farhub.org. That's scenarios.farhub.org. You can follow us across social media by searching for Scenario Futures, all one word. You can subscribe to Scenarios for Tomorrow wherever you listen to your podcasts. Today's track was composed by Rocket, whose links are provided in the show notes. This is Scenarios for Tomorrow, where tomorrow's headlines start as today's thought experiments.